The Neolithic High (Neolithic) age, era, or period, from nu epsilon omicron sigma and lambda iota theta omicron sigma, or New Stone Age, was a period in the development of human technology, beginning about 10,200 BC, according to the ASPRO chronology, in some parts of the Middle East, and later in other parts of the world, and ending between 4,500 and 2000 BC. Traditionally considered the last part of the Stone Age, the Neolithic followed the terminal Holocene Epipaleolithic period and commenced with the beginning of farming, which produced the Neolithic Revolution. It ended when metal tools became widespread. The Neolithic is a progression of behavioral and cultural characteristics and changes, including the use of wild and domestic crops and of domesticated animals. The beginning of the Neolithic culture is considered to be in the Levant about 10,200–8,800 BC. It developed directly from the Epipaleolithic Natufian culture in the region, whose people pioneered the use of wild cereals, which then evolved into true farming. The Natufian period was between 12,000 and 10,200 BC, and the so-called Proto-Neolithic is now included in the pre-Pottery Neolithic between 10,200 and 8,800 BC, as the Natufians had become dependent on wild cereals in their diet, and a sedentary way of life had begun among them. The climatic changes associated with the Younger Dryas are thought to have forced people to develop farming. By 10,200–8,800 BC, farming communities arose in the Levant and spread to Asia Minor, North Africa and North Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia is the site of the earliest developments of the Neolithic Revolution from around 10,000 BC. It has been identified as having inspired some of the most important developments in human history, including the invention of the wheel, the planting of the first cereal crops, and the development of cursive script, mathematics, astronomy and agriculture. Early Neolithic farming was limited to a narrow range of plants, both wild and domesticated, which included einkorn wheat, millet and spelt, and the keeping of dogs, sheep and goats. By about 6,900–6,400 BC, it included domesticated cattle and pigs, the establishment of permanently or seasonally inhabited settlements, and the use of pottery. Not all of these cultural elements characteristic of the Neolithic appeared everywhere in the same order. The earliest farming societies in the Near East did not use pottery. In other parts of the world, such as Africa, South Asia and Southeast Asia, independent domestication events led to their own regionally distinctive Neolithic cultures that arose completely independent of those in Europe and Southwest Asia. Early Japanese societies and other East Asian cultures used pottery before developing agriculture. Unlike the Paleolithic, when more than one human species existed, only one human species reached the Neolithic. Homo floresiensis may have survived right up to the very dawn of the Neolithic, about 12,200 years ago. The term Neolithic derives from the Greek nu epsilon omicron lambda iota theta iota kappa omicron sigma, Neolithikos, from nu epsilon omicron sigma neos, new, plus lambda iota theta omicron sigma lithos, stone, literally meaning New Stone Age. The term was invented by Sir John Lubbock in 1865 as a refinement of the three-age system. Periods by pottery phase. In the Middle East, cultures identified as Neolithic began appearing by in the 10th millennium BCE. Early development occurred in the Levant and from there spread eastwards and westwards. Neolithic cultures are also attested in southeastern Anatolia and northern Mesopotamia by c. 8000 BCE. The prehistoric Baifudi site near Yizhan in Hebei Province, China, contains relics of a culture contemporaneous with the Sichuan and Xinglongwa cultures of about 5000–6000 BCE. Neolithic cultures east of the Taihang Mountains, filling in an archaeological gap between the two northern Chinese cultures. The total excavated area is more than 1,200 square yards, and the collection of Neolithic findings at the site encompasses two phases. Neolithic I pre-pottery Neolithic A. The Neolithic I period began roughly 10,000 years ago in the Levant. A temple area in southeastern Turkey at Göbekli Tepe dated around 9500 BC may be regarded as the beginning of the period. This site was developed by nomadic hunter-gatherer tribes, evidenced by the lack of permanent housing in the vicinity, and may be the oldest known human-made place of worship. At least 7 stone circles, covering 25 acres, contain limestone pillars carved with animals, insects, and birds. Stone tools were used by perhaps as many as hundreds of people to create the pillars, which might have supported roofs. Other early PPNA sites dating to around 9,500 to 9,000 BCE have been found in Jericho, Israel, Gilgal in the Jordan Valley, and Byblos, Lebanon. The start of Neolithic I overlaps the Tahunian and Heavy Neolithic periods to some degree. The major advance of Neolithic I was true farming. In the Proto-Neolithic Natufian cultures, wild cereals were harvested, and perhaps early seed selection and reseeding occurred. The grain was ground into flour. Emmer wheat was domesticated, and animals were herded and domesticated. In the 21st century, remains of figs were discovered in a house in Jericho dated to 9400 BCE. The figs are of a mutant variety that cannot be pollinated by insects, and therefore the trees can only reproduce from cuttings. This evidence suggests that figs were the first cultivated crop and marked the invention of the technology of farming. This occurred centuries before the first cultivation of grains. Settlements became more permanent with circular houses, much like those of the Natufians, with single rooms. However, these houses were for the first time made of mud brick. The settlement had a surrounding stone wall and perhaps a stone tower. The wall served as protection from nearby groups, as protection from floods, or to keep animals penned. Some of the enclosures also suggest grain and meat storage. Neolithic II pre-pottery Neolithic B. The Neolithic II began around 8800 BCE according to the ASPRO chronology in the Levant. As with the PPNA dates, there are two versions from the same laboratories noted above. This system of terminology, however, is not convenient for Southeast Anatolia and settlements of the Middle Anatolia Basin. This era was before the Mesolithic era. A settlement of 3,000 inhabitants was found in the outskirts of Amman, Jordan, considered to be one of the largest prehistoric settlements in the Near East, called Ain Ghazal. It was continuously inhabited from approximately 7,250 to 5,000 B. Settlements have rectangular mud brick houses where the family lived together in single or multiple rooms. Burial findings suggest an ancestor cult where people preserved skulls of the dead, which were plastered with mud to make facial features. The rest of the corpse could have been left outside the settlement to decay until only the bones were left. Then the bones were buried inside the settlement underneath the floor or between houses. Neolithic III pottery Neolithic The Neolithic III began around 6400 BCE in the Fertile Crescent. By then distinctive cultures emerged, with pottery like the Halafian and Ubaid. This period has been further divided into PNA and PNB at some sites. The Chalcolithic period began about 4500 BCE, then the Bronze Age began about 3500 BCE, replacing the Neolithic cultures. Periods by region. Fertile Crescent around 10,200 BC. The first fully developed Neolithic cultures belonging to the phase pre-pottery Neolithic A appeared in the Fertile Crescent. Around 10,700 to 9,400 BC a settlement was established in Tel Naramal, 10 miles north of Aleppo. The settlement included two temples dating back to 9,650. Around 9000 BC during the PPNA, one of the world's first towns, Jericho, appeared in the Levant. It was surrounded by a stone and marble wall and contained a population of 2,000 to 3,000 people and a massive stone tower. Around 6400 BC, the Halaf culture appeared in Lebanon, Israel and Palestine, Syria, Anatolia, and northern Mesopotamia and subsisted on dryland agriculture. In 1981, a team of researchers from the Maison de l'Orient et de la Méditerranée, including Jack Owen and Oliver Orange, divided Near East Neolithic chronology into 10 periods based on social, economic and cultural characteristics. In 2002, Danielle Stauder and Frédéric Abs advanced this system with a division into 5 periods. Nachafian between 12,000 and 10,200 BC, Kayamian between 10,200–8,800 BC, PPNA, Sultanian, Mourabitian, early PPNB between 8,800–7,600 BC, Middle PPNB 7,600–6,900 BC, Late PPNB between 7,500 and 7,000 BC, and a PPNB transitional stage where Halaf and dark-faced burnished ware began to emerge between 6,900–6,400 BC. They also advanced the idea of a transitional stage between the PPNA and PPNB between 8,800 and 8,600 BC at sites like Jerf el Lama and Tel Aswad. Southern Mesopotamia alluvial plains. Little rainfall makes irrigation systems necessary. Ubaid culture from 6,900 BC. North Africa domestication of sheep and goats reached Egypt from the Near East possibly as early as 6,000 BC. Graham Barker states, the first indisputable evidence for domestic plants and animals in the Nile Valley is not until the early 5th millennium BC, in northern Egypt, and 1,000 years later further south. In both cases as part of strategies that still relied heavily on fishing, hunting, and the gathering of wild plants, and suggests that these subsistence changes were not due to farmers migrating from the Near East but was an indigenous development, with cereals either indigenous or obtained through exchange. Other scholars argue that the primary stimulus for agriculture and domesticated animals in Egypt was from the Middle East. Europe. In Southeast Europe, agrarian societies first appeared in the 7th millennium BC, attested by one of the earliest farming sites of Europe, discovered in Vashtami, southeastern Albania and dating back to 6,500 BC. Anthropomorphic figurines have been found in the Balkans from 6000 BC, and in Central Europe by c. 5800 BC. Among the earliest cultural complexes of this area are the Sesklo culture in Thessaly, which later expanded in the Balkans, giving rise to Star Savo Chorus, Linear Band Keramik, and Vinca, through a combination of cultural diffusion and migration of peoples. The Neolithic traditions spread west and northwards to reach northwestern Europe by around 4500 BC. The Vinca culture may have created the earliest system of writing, the Vinca signs, though archaeologist Shan Win believes they most likely represented pictograms and ideograms rather than a truly developed form of writing. The Cucutani Tripolian culture built enormous settlements in Romania, Moldova, and Ukraine from 5300 to 2300 BC. The megalithic temple complexes of Gantia on the Mediterranean island of Gozo and of Najdra are notable for their gigantic Neolithic structures, the oldest of which date back to c. 3600 BC. The Hypogeum of Halsaflioni, Parola, Malta, is a subterranean structure excavated c. 2500 BC, originally a sanctuary. It became an acropolis, the only prehistoric underground temple in the world, and showing a degree of artistry in stone sculpture unique in prehistory to the Maltese Islands. After 2500 BC, the Maltese Islands were depopulated for several decades until the arrival of a new influx of Bronze Age immigrants. a culture that cremated its dead, and introduced smaller megalithic structures called dolmens to Malta. In most cases there are small chambers here, with the cover made of a large slab placed on upright stones. They are claimed to belong to a population certainly different from that which built the previous megalithic temples. It is presumed the population arrived from Sicily because of the similarity of Maltese dolmens to some small constructions found in the largest island of the Mediterranean Sea. South and East Asia. The earliest Neolithic site in South Asia is Meghar, dated to 7500 BC, in the Karachi plain of Balochistan, Pakistan. The site has evidence of farming and herding. In South India, the Neolithic began by 6500 BC and lasted until around 1400 BC when the megalithic transition period began. South Indian Neolithic is characterized by ash mounds since 2500 BC in Karnataka region, expanded later to Tamil Nadu. In East Asia, the earliest sites include Nanjangti culture around 9500 BC to 9000 BC, Pengtushan culture around 7500 BC to 6100 BC, and Pelagang culture around 7000 BC to 5000 BC. The Neolithic remains a living tradition in small and extremely remote and inaccessible pockets of West Papua. Polished stone adze and axes are used in the present day in areas where the availability of metal implements is limited. This is likely to cease altogether in the next few years as the older generation die off and steel blades and chainsaws prevail. In 2012, news was released about a new farming site discovered in Munam-ri, Goseong, Gangwon Province, South Korea, which may be the earliest farmland known to date in East Asia. No remains of an agricultural field from the Neolithic period have been found in any East Asian country before, the institute said, adding that the discovery reveals that the history of agricultural cultivation at least began during the period on the Korean peninsula. The farm was dated between 3600 and 3000 BC. Pottery, stone projectile points, and possible houses were also found. In 2002, researchers discovered prehistoric earthenware, jade earrings, among other items in the area. The research team will perform accelerator mass spectrometry dating to retrieve a more precise date for the site. America. In Mesoamerica, a similar set of events occurred by around 4500 BC, but possibly as early as 11,000–10,000 BC. These cultures are usually not referred to as belonging to the Neolithic. In America, different terms are used, such as formative stage instead of mid-late Neolithic, Archaic era instead of early Neolithic, and Paleo-Indian for the preceding period. The formative stage is equivalent to the Neolithic Revolution period in Europe, Asia, and Africa. In the southwestern United States it occurred from 500 to 1200 CE, when there was a dramatic increase in population and development of large villages supported by agriculture based on dryland farming of maize, and later, beans, squash, and domesticated turkeys. During this period the bow and arrow and ceramic pottery were also introduced. Social organization. During most of the Neolithic age of Eurasia, people lived in small tribes composed of multiple bands or lineages. There is little scientific evidence of developed social stratification in most Neolithic societies. Social stratification is more associated with the later Bronze Age, although some late Eurasian Neolithic societies formed complex stratified chiefdoms or even states. States evolved in Eurasia only with the rise of metallurgy, and most Neolithic societies on the whole were relatively simple and egalitarian. Beyond Eurasia, however, states were formed during the local Neolithic in three areas, namely in the pre-Ceramic Andes with the Norte Chico civilization, formative Mesoamerica, and ancient Hawaii. However, most Neolithic societies were noticeably more hierarchical than the Paleolithic cultures that preceded them and hunter-gatherer cultures in general. The domestication of large animals resulted in a dramatic increase in social inequality in most of the areas where it occurred, New Guinea being the notable exception. Possession of livestock allowed competition between households and resulted in inherited inequalities of wealth. Neolithic pastoralists who controlled large herds gradually acquired more livestock, and this made economic inequalities more pronounced. However, evidence of social inequality is still disputed, as settlements such as Catalhouyuk reveal a striking lack of difference in the size of homes and burial sites, suggesting a more egalitarian society with no evidence of the concept of capital. Although some homes do appear slightly larger or more elaborately decorated than others, families and households were still largely independent economically, and the household was probably the center of life. However, excavations in Central Europe have revealed that early Neolithic linear ceramic cultures were building large arrangements of circular ditches. Between 4800 BC and 4600 BC, these structures required considerable time and labor to construct, which suggests that some influential individuals were able to organize and direct human labor, though non-hierarchical and voluntary work remain possibilities. There is a large body of evidence for fortified settlements at linear bandkeramik sites along the Rhine, as at least some villages were fortified for some time with a palisade and an outer ditch. Settlements with palisades and weapon-traumatized bones have been discovered, such as at the Talheim death pit, demonstrates systematic violence between groups, and warfare was probably much more common during the Neolithic than in the preceding Paleolithic period. This supplanted an earlier view of the linear pottery culture as living a peaceful, unfortified lifestyle. Control of labor and intergroup conflict is characteristic of corporate-level or tribal groups, headed by a charismatic individual, whether a big man or a proto-chief, functioning as a lineage group head. Whether a non-hierarchical system of organization existed is debatable, and there is no evidence that explicitly suggests that Neolithic societies functioned under any dominating class or individual, as was the case in the chiefdoms of the European Early Bronze Age. Theories to explain the apparent implied egalitarianism of Neolithic societies have arisen, notably the Marxist concept of primitive communism. Shelter. The shelter of the early people changed dramatically from the Paleolithic to the Neolithic era. In the Paleolithic, people did not normally live in permanent constructions. In the Neolithic, mud brick houses started appearing that were coated with plaster. The growth of agriculture made permanent houses possible. Doorways were made on the roof, with ladders positioned both on the inside and outside of the houses. The roof was supported by beams from the inside. The rough ground was covered by platforms, mats, and skins on which residents slept. Stilt houses settlements were common in the Alpine and Pianura Padana region. Remains have been found at the Ljubljana marshes in Slovenia and at the Mondsee and Attersee lakes in Upper Austria, for example.